Research writing from sources, plagiarism, and integrating sources, Part 2. Avoiding plagiarism. Plagiarism is using someone else's ideas or words without giving them credit. To avoid plagiarism, always document your sources. Avoiding plagiarism includes material that requires acknowledgement. This would be direct quotes, paraphrases, and summaries. Arguable statements and information that is not commonly known, such as statistics and other data. Personal or professional opinions and assertions of others. Visuals that you did not create yourself, such as charts or photographs. Collaborative help you received from others. Material that does not require acknowledgement includes facts that are common knowledge. For instance, the current President of the United States. Everyone would know that. Or well-known statements accompanied by a signal phrase. As John F. Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you." There are different types of source integration. One of these is summarizing. This is when the main points of the text are important to your argument, but the details can be left out in the interest of conciseness. There is paraphrasing, when the meaning of a text is important, but the original language is not essential, or when clarifying or interpreting the ideas in the text. When quoting, this is when the exact wording is critical to making the point, or when the wording itself is part of what is analyzed. Summarizing means to put the main idea in your own words. Understand it and support it. Cite the source. This is shorter than your original work because you omit examples and facts. It has a broader focus on a particular subject. Paraphrasing is taking a particular part of an original work and putting it in your own words, usually about the same length as the original work, and it has a broader focus than a quote, but narrower than a summary. Quoting is when you use the exact wording from the original text. It is very narrow or focused in view. It does not use your own words, and it is used for passages that convey powerful points or arguments. An example of an original quotation. Such intuition is even making its way, albeit slowly, into scholarly circles where recognition is mounting that ever-increasing pressures on ecosystems, life-supporting environmental services, and critical natural cycles are driven not only by the sheer number of resource users and the inefficiencies of their resource use, but also by the patterns of resource use themselves. In global environmental policy-making arenas, it is becoming more and more difficult to ignore the fact that the overdeveloped North must restrain its consumption if it expects the underdeveloped South to embrace a more sustainable trajectory. An example of a summary of that same information would be, environmental consequences of consumption may be a more significant cause of environmental problems than increasing population is. An example of a quotation would be, ever-increasing pressures on ecosystems, life-supporting environmental services, and critical natural cycles are driven not only by the sheer number of resource users, but also by the patterns of resource use themselves. Example of a paraphrase of that same material would be, Scholars are coming to believe that consumption is partly to blame for changes in ecosystems, reduction of essential natural resources, and changes in natural cycles. Policymakers increasingly see that developing nations will not adopt practices that reduce pollution and waste unless wealthy nations consume less. Rising population around the world does cause significant stress on the environment, but consumption is increasing even more rapidly than population. For parenthetical or in-text citations in MLA format, if the author is not named in the text, include the name in parentheses before the page reference. This is example 1. Among African cities, says one observer, in Johannesburg a spirit of optimism glows. If the author is named in the text, do not include the name in parentheses. Example 2. According to Gaddis, in the African city of Johannesburg, a spirit of optimism glows. That's on page 155. If you have a long quotation in MLA format, if you're quoting a source and it is more than 4 lines when typed, indent the quote 1 inch from the left margin and omit quotation marks. For example, in the influential Tally's Corner from 1967, Elliot Lebo observes that unskilled construction work requires more skill than is generally assumed. A healthy, sturdy, active man of good intelligence requires from 2 to 4 weeks to break in on a construction job. It frequently happens that his foreman or the craftsman he services is not willing to wait that long for him to get into condition, or to learn at a glance the difference in size between a rough 2x8 and a finished 2x10. That's on page 62. The use of ellipses in quotations. Ellipses marks, the 3 little dots you see there, indicate omissions at the beginning of, within a sentence, or at the end of a sentence. You leave 1 space before and after an ellipses mark. If omission is at the end of a sentence without parenthetical, include the closing punctuation before the ellipsis. For example, Wilson writes, "Earth is our home." He has put the ellipsis plus the closing punctuation, the period. When omission is at the beginning of a sentence, leaving a complete sentence, use a bracket around the first letter, capitalize it, and omit the ellipsis. For example, brackets around human, capitalized H. Human physical and spiritual health, Wilson writes, depends on sustaining the planet in a relatively unaltered state. Now, if you will click on the link at the bottom of the page, you can download a worksheet that will help you understand and remember what you have just learned about integrating sources in your work.